A genre of entertainment that I really love is the fantasy genre, and a big reason is that I just love the style of music that typically gets to accompany stories that have a sort of medieval setting. As a professional composer for films, TV, and games, this is a really great and important style to be able to write music in, because the truth is the fantasy genre has produced some of the greatest entertainment of all time, and it's just not going anywhere anytime soon. It might fall out of fashion periodically, but it always comes back, and truthfully, I don't actually get to write in this style as much as I would like to, simply because a lot of my work in film and TV has been inspired by stories that are in a more modern setting. However, a little bit ago, I got a really fun project in that I'm working on right now, and for the pitch, they wanted to hear music I'd made in this genre. So at the time, I didn't actually feel like I had enough in my existing portfolio, and therefore I made a piece from scratch. And in this video, I wanted to sort of recreate my experience for you of composing this track from scratch, from coming up with the chords and the melody, all the way through having multiple live soloists and performers on the demo to make it sound as great as possible. I'm even going to go into detail how I blend all these live and MIDI elements together to sort of create a piece of music that sounds like a real section actually performed on the final piece. Let's now make an emotional, dramatic string piece that's going to help us to set the tone for a medieval fantasy world. So when creating a string track like this, or basically any track, the first thing to do is just get an idea out there in its simplest form. And so what I like to do is with strings, I have these like really old Giga Studio strings that I like to use to just sort of like sketch out ideas. And that's what I did right here. Is I have them split out in the high strings and low strings. And I just kind of created this like little thematic material that I felt would work well for this kind of world and setting. And this is what it sounds like. Cool, so that's just sort of like the first iteration of the theme, and that was just to get the idea out there. And it's got a little bit of a feeling, I think that it's got a little bit of like a regalness to it, which makes sense because again, medieval, you're thinking kings and queens and stuff, dragons and knights. So now the next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna integrate the low strings into here. In doing that, we kind of get to flesh out the chords a little bit more. And what I do with these low strings, these are really just sort of like the octave, bass, and cellos in the really low register. As we get the idea to start fleshing out, then you're gonna see how we break this out to the other sections. So just stick with me and I promise you'll see how it fills out and gets really cool. Let's now listen to this with the low strings that I've added. So you can really hear how that fills out the chords kind of nicely in the low end. It adds a little more warmth. It's starting to get things to move along. What I'm gonna do in the second half of this, before I start breaking things out, is I wanna just show you how I wanna just go into the next section, because I'm gonna take that theme from the beginning and I'm just gonna basically apply it now to the second half, but I'm gonna go up an octave higher, and I'm gonna start filling out the harmony a little bit more with everything in the middle here. So listen to how that now evolves in the second half of this piece of music. Again, this is all just these two really crappy string patches to sort of sketch out an idea. Cool. So you can really hear that that's starting to flesh out. But you can hear that when we move that lead part up an octave and we double it, and then we're able to sort of like add some more harmony here in the middle, it really kind of helps things to sound a bit fuller. It adds just a lot more emotion and everything to the piece. So now let's kind of look at what we're going to do next. Before we go any further than that, I want to show you how I'm going to basically take that sketch and split it out. I'm going to add these strings to the individual string patches that make up the string ensemble. So violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, bass, and I'm going to program them individually. I go into a lot more detail in my course, Modern Scoring Mastery, about how I like to program strings, but the gist of it is that you don't want to just copy and paste your programming from your ensemble patch. You want to do individual programming for every string in the ensemble so that your intention is clearly stated and what each string is doing at different times is properly represented by the different MIDI parameters. It's just really important to make sure you're not just doing a copy and paste. If you do that, it'll sound robotic and not really great. So here's what this ensemble sounds like now. You can hear that that's definitely more rosiny and more realistic than those sort of synthetic ensemble patches I was using to sketch out the idea. There's still work that needs to be done to sort of flesh that out and make it sound, you know, as realistic as possible. But what I want to do next is show you how I'm going to split that out and start adding other colors so that it can sound more realistic by combining other parts of the orchestra. Now when we add the brass, as you can see here, I've got just the low brass ensemble, trombones. This is the 6-horn ensemble from Cinestrings. And it really sort of helps to just fill out the sonic realm a little bit. So you can see I'm like delaying bringing in the 6-horn ensemble, and that's because we just want it to sort of enter and slowly build. And as the piece builds, look at the modulation. You can tell that we're sort of getting more regal and more brassy. Let me show you the brass first on its own so you can kind of hear how it's filling out that midsection. So that's really going to sort of add some nice mid-range and some warmth to the track. It's going to fill out the strings and blend nicely. This is what that sounds like with all the strings together. So I think that's pretty cool. So now let's look for other elements that are going to help us sort of really make this into a fantasy piece and sort of bring us into a world. We've got now the idea fleshed out a little bit more, so it's time to start adding these other elements. So the next thing I'll do in order to do that, I feel like woodwinds are a really great representation of a fantasy world. The truth is, the opportunities I have to use woodwinds in a score is very slim. So most of the time it has to be a period piece or something that allows it to get past the executives and producers. They're typically labeled as being a little more old-fashioned, but with fantasy music, it really sort of makes the piece, and so we're definitely going to combine some of that. Again, this is not an endorsement. I don't have any affiliation with Cinesamples other than the fact that I've just always used them, but these are Cinewinds from Cinesamples, and I think blending these in is going to make a really big difference. What I've got here is I have just the bass flute, I have a regular flute, and I've got the Irish whistle. And I'm going to play you back now what it sounds like when all those are blended in with it. Here are the woodwinds. So I think that definitely works really nicely. It's certainly sounding a lot more fantasy oriented with that. Let's keep adding on to that to sort of, again, start building out a world, because it's not enough to just have the strings and brass. We're really just trying to sell the fact that we can work within this genre. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to combine all that with some choirs. I'm just going to blend them in so it adds like a little bit more room tone. So if we go in here, I just love this choir from Dio. It's really, really effective. I've used this on tons and tons of projects. So I'm just going to solo this for you so you can kind of get an idea of what it sounds like. And I want you to keep in mind too, all these elements on their own sound like MIDI a lot more than when they're played all together. And that's because, especially with the orchestra, when you combine all the different elements together, they kind of like cover up the blemishes or the shortcomings of the MIDI programming or the MIDI in the other sections. So if you just played the string ensemble on its own without the brass, it's going to sound a little bit less real than if you combine it with the brass. And likewise, if you play the strings and brass on their own without the choir, those are going to sound a little less real. So when you stack stuff in a more orchestral setting like this, it really helps to add a sense of realism. So especially those room tones, that's going to blend really nicely with the brass and the strings, and it's going to add a much more epic feeling to the whole piece. I'm combining that though with this other choir I just love, again from Cinesamples. This is called Men of the North. And what I've done is I've actually separated that out. I've taken the lead line from this piece of music and I've given it its own patch. And then I'm blending that with what they call the Dragonborn mix, and it's the vowel morph from Men of the North. And so that's giving you more of the chords and stuff. And listen to how these choirs now sound blended together. So it kind of takes into consideration that principle that when you start stacking and layering these things, it kind of helps to add to the sense of realism, and it also makes things sound a bit more epic. When you're talking about a fantasy soundtrack, epic is sort of like what you want to go for sometimes. So I want you to keep in mind when I play this back now, we started with just that really bare bones sort of synthetic ensemble string patch. We split it out to all the strings, and then we kind of like blended it with some brass, we blended it then with some woodwinds, and now we're adding the choir on top of it. And listen to what a difference it makes. I'm going to play it first for you, how I showed you my initial sketch with just that ensemble patch, and then I'm going to play it back with all these other elements. Alright, so now hear it when we've split that idea out to the rest of the orchestra and choir. So I think that's really effective. And here's the thing, a lot of people are going to leave it at that and they're going to send out the pitch and that's going to be that. I always like to put my best foot forward, and when it's a piece of music that I like, I just want to hear it the way that it was intended. So in this case, what I did was I had some soloists perform the parts of the string players multiple times so that we can kind of create like a fake orchestra, so to speak. Even if it's just a few takes of a live performer, it just goes a long way to adding this like human element to the piece of music, and it makes it more emotional and it makes everything just kind of sound better. But you do have to process it a certain way so that it doesn't sound like it was recorded in a cheap room. In this case, it looks like I had these players do like 2 takes of each part, and then I just blended that in to make a small ensemble. So what I've done is I've added a separate bus for each of these instruments. Here's violin live, viola live, cello live, and then they all feed into what I'm calling the strings live ensemble. And then I've also got the live string solo, because there's some tracks that I wanted to not sound like an ensemble, but actually like a soloist that plays over everything. Most of the processing is being done in the string live ensemble bus, because that way I can treat it the same way that I would a live ensemble. The first thing that I'm running it through, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about this if you're a viewer of this channel, is I'm running it through Ocean Way Studios, and I'm just using their Studio A strings preset. It's really great. It usually comes with these mics muted here, so I'm just gonna add them in because I want to have a more realistic tone. So I just add in these extra mics. I've got the near, mid, and far, and I'm just gonna kind of dial in a mix that sounds good to me. The next thing I'm doing is I'm adding this Kramer tape plugin, which just adds a little bit of delay that's just very natural. It kind of, again, sort of replicates things being recorded to tape and just having a more natural vibe. Of course, I'm going to add my favorite reverb here for strings, which is the Lexicon 224, and then I'm going to blend that with the Valhalla Room. And what I want to do is I want to show you what these individual players sound like with just the files that they sent me, and then I'm going to play it with all these plugins on it so you can hear what a difference it makes. It doesn't sound bad because they have a great remote setup, each of these performers. However, you can hear that it's much more in your face. The recordings are really direct. And when you're trying to blend that with the MIDI, it's not going to sound as natural. You want it to sound like the mics are a little further away and you've got more room tones. So now what I've done on top of that is I've added a single solo violin, which is really going to sort of like tie everything together. It's sort of like the icing on the cake. This is the performance here by Max. That alone, just sort of sitting on top of the rest of the track, is going to add realism to everything beneath it. Listen to that with the solo instruments, and then I'm going to blend in the MIDI for you. Cool, so as you can see here in the solo track, I've processed it the same way that I have for the rest of the live players. I've just added a little decapitator, which I like to do just to give a little bit more body and depth to the solo. Let's now go up here and I want to show you what a difference it makes to just add a couple performances from some soloists and blend it in with everything else. If I take that out, so you're gonna see me over here, I'm just gonna mute and unmute the live players so you can hear the difference. So I'm hoping that that illustrates how powerful it can be to just sketch out an idea, on a single ensemble patch doesn't need to sound great, but then as you break it out to the different sections of the orchestra and as you begin layering things, it starts to create what's a much more realistic sounding mock-up and also just a much more powerful, much more emotional piece of music. Let's now listen back to this whole piece of music so that you can hear how it all came together. And when we listen back, I want you to keep in mind how we started with just that pair of ensemble patches for the strings, and then we broke it out to the full string ensemble, then we added the brass, we added the choir, then we added the woodwinds, and how each time we added something, it added a layer of detail that helped the whole piece sound more impactful and realistic. So I think it sounds pretty great. If you have any questions about what we've gone over in the video, just leave them in the comment section below. I try to get back to everyone, and also you just never know who might have the same question as you but is afraid to ask. So I encourage you to use this as a resource to learn and grow. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to continue learning more to level up as a professional composer for media, just make sure to check out my educational platform, modernmediacomposer.com. You can get access to free virtual instruments by signing up for our mailing list. And as I mentioned, I also have our first premium course, Modern Scoring Mastery, where we take a much deeper dive into the world of producing music for film and TV, and I even demonstrate scoring to picture from scratch for professional productions. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with me today. I can't wait to see you in the next video, and until then, I hope this was helpful.